The helicopter banked sharply over the last ridge, revealing my home for the next 6 months. Copper Mountain Fire. Lookout stood alone on a rocky outcropping, a simple wooden structure perched above the tree line like a solitary chess piece on a vast green board. "Copper Mountain coming up on your right," the pilot said through my headset. "Pretty spot. Isolated as hell." That was exactly what I wanted. After signing the final divorce papers 3 weeks ago, isolation seemed like the only cure. Seattle had become full of memories. Favorite restaurants now off limits, friends awkwardly choosing sides, an empty apartment that reminded me of everything that had gone wrong. The pilot set the helicopter down in a small clearing about 50 yards from the tower. The downdraft blew pine needles into swirls around us. "Help me unload," he said after cutting the engine. "Got a storm front moving in tonight. Need to beat it back to Jackson." I grabbed the heavy supply bags while he took the food containers. The Forest Service told me exactly what to expect. No running water except what I collected from rain, a propane stove, solar panels for basic electricity, and an outhouse about 20 steps from the main tower. It definitely wasn't fancy. The tower was about 40 feet tall, with wooden steps zigzagging up to the main cabin. My footsteps made hollow thuds as I climbed. The pine forest spread out in every direction below me, except for some rocky areas and occasional meadows. I couldn't see any other signs of people anywhere. The pilot made 2 more trips with me before checking his watch. "Radio check-in with base is at 1800 hours, he said, handing me a sealed envelope. "Instructions are all in here. Any last questions before I head out?" "I think I've got it covered." He nodded once, businesslike, and went back down the steps. I watched the helicopter lift off, feeling relieved but worried as it got smaller before disappearing behind a distant ridge. The silence was sudden after all that noise. I turned to face my new home. The cabin measured maybe 15 feet square, with windows on all sides to allow for 360-degree visibility. A desk wrapped around 3 walls, fitted with maps, a pair of high-powered binoculars on a swivel mount, and a Forest Service radio. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, with the propane stove and a tiny refrigerator powered by the solar panels. My bed, really just a cot with a thin mattress, sat in the 4th corner beside a small bookshelf. I unpacked carefully, arranging my clothes in the single dresser, and setting up my personal items. A few books, a battery-powered radio, a framed photo of my parents that I paused over before placing face down in a drawer. Nothing from the marriage had made the journey with me. At exactly 1800 hours, the radio crackled to life. "Copper Mountain Lookout, this is Bridger Teton Base. Come in, Copper Mountain." I picked up the receiver, pressing the talk button. "This is Copper Mountain Lookout. Matthew Anderson reporting." "Welcome to the mountain, Anderson. This is Robert. Got yourself situated up there?" "Yes, sir. All supplies received and stored." "Good. Protocol is simple. Radio check-ins twice daily, 0800 and 1800 hours. Report any smoke sightings immediately using the coordinates on your map grid. Any emergencies, use channel 2 and repeat your call 3 times." "Understood. Weather report shows clear skies tomorrow after tonight's system passes. Good day to learn your territory. Any questions?" I thought for a moment. "How many acres am I responsible for watching?" "Your primary zone is about 20,000 acres, but on clear days, you can spot smoke up to 50 miles out. Maps in your desk have it all marked. Remember, you're our eyes up there." "Got it. All right then. Base out." The radio went silent, leaving me alone with the building wind outside. I made a simple dinner from my supplies, pasta with canned sauce, and watched darkness cover the forest below. The storm arrived just as the pilot had predicted, rain hitting against the windows while thunder boomed across the valleys. I lay in bed listening to all the noise, strangely comforted by nature's indifference to human problems. My first week passed in a blur of routine building and exploration. Each morning began with looking around the horizon through binoculars, slowly working my way around a full 360 degrees, checking for any smoke in the sky. The Forest Service had provided detailed maps with key landmarks labeled Cathedral Rock to the north, Blackwater Creek winding through the eastern valley, Dead Man's Ridge standing tall to the southwest. I took careful notes on weather conditions 4 times daily: temperature, wind direction, humidity, all factors that could turn a small lightning strike into a raging inferno. Between observations, I hiked the nearby trails, never going more than an hour from the tower. The exercise felt good after months of sitting around my apartment back in Seattle. The alone time that had initially attracted me to the job soon became its own kind of therapy. No emails to check, no text messages, no well-meaning friends asking how I was holding up. Just me, the mountain, and the simple responsibility of watching for fire. At night, the forest came alive with sound. Coyotes yipped and howled in the distance. Owls called from nearby trees. Small creatures rustled through the bushes. Sometimes I sat outside on the tower's small porch, letting the darkness erase everything but the present moment. On my 8th day, while reorganizing the desk drawers to my liking, I found them. A stack of logbooks from previous lookouts. The Forest Service required daily record keeping, and it seemed the people before me had different attitudes toward the task. Some books contained the bare minimum. Clear skies, no smoke, repeated day after day. Others included detailed observations about wildlife, changing seasons, or the mental challenges of being alone. I flipped through them with growing interest, feeling a connection to these unknown people who had sat where I now sat, watching the same views, dealing with the same loneliness. The most recent logbook caught my eye. The label read simply, Wilson, Season 2022. Unlike the others, this one was only partially filled. I opened to the first page, finding neat, measured handwriting. May 12, 2022. David Wilson reporting for 2nd season at Copper Mountain Lookout. Clear conditions, light southerly winds, spotted elk herd in eastern meadow. No smoke. I looked ahead through David's careful record keeping. He wrote down everything from bird migrations to mushroom growths with great detail. His handwriting stayed the same throughout, and his notes were thorough and factual. But as I looked through the later entries, I noticed small changes. The handwriting became a bit messier. Short personal thoughts started showing up between his professional notes. August 2nd, 2022. Clear skies, high fire danger. Strange quiet in NW quadrant today. No birds calling, something feels off. I continued reading, drawn in by David's increasingly personal tone. The final entries in the book struck me as oddly abrupt, ending in mid-season. The last date marked was October 15th, with a full month of the typical fire lookout season remaining. As darkness fell outside the tower windows, I pulled the logbook closer, suddenly very curious about what had happened to David Wilson and why he hadn't completed his season. The radio crackled, startling me. Copper Mountain Lookout, this is base. Evening check-in. I set the logbook aside and reached for the receiver, my mind still lingering on those final entries and the person who had written them. The radio conversation with Robert ended, and I put the receiver back in its cradle. With darkness falling outside the tower windows, I went back to the wooden chair and pulled David Wilson's logbook into my lap. I flipped back to the beginning, wanting to understand the full story. The early entries were straightforward, written in a steady hand that showed a careful mind. May 12, 2022. Clear conditions, temperature 62 degrees at EU 800 hours, wind SSW at 812 fomios, no smoke, spotted 3 bald eagles soaring over Cathedral Rock. Day after day, David had recorded temperatures, wind patterns, humidity levels, and wildlife sightings with scientific precision. His language was crisp and professional, focusing on the data rather than personal impressions. I recognized the approach. It was how I had begun my own logs, though without his attention to detail. As May turned to June in David's account, his entries remained consistent but began to include more observations about the surrounding wilderness. June 17, 2022, warm day, high fire risk with drought conditions continuing. Noted unusual deer behavior in the northern meadow. Herd of 6 mule deer appeared agitated, refused to graze in eastern section despite abundant forage. Will monitor for predator activity. My eyes lingered on this entry. It seemed harmless enough. Wildlife behavior changed based on many things from predator movements to small changes in vegetation. Yet something in his wording caught my attention. I kept reading. Through late June and early July, David stuck to his professional tone while adding more wildlife notes. He tracked migration patterns, feeding behaviors, and counted animals with great care. Everything looked fine until I got to an entry from mid-July. July 14, 2022. Weather unchanged. No smoke sightings. The birdsong stopped at 14:32 hours today. Complete silence fell over the NW quadrant for 27 minutes before resuming. No visual cause identified. The precision of his time measurement, 27 minutes, suggested he'd been counting. I tried to imagine sitting in this same chair, watching the silent forest below, keeping track as the seconds ticked by. By early August, David's entries began to change in subtle ways. His handwriting remained neat, but his language became less formal. Personal observations crept in alongside the weather data. August 3rd, 2022. Clear skies. 84-degree F at noon. Something is wrong with the forest below North Ridge. No wildlife movement for third consecutive day. The absence is noticeable, like a void that shouldn't exist. August 7th, 2022. Dry conditions continue. No prey birds hunting over East Valley anymore. The quiet at night is complete now. No insects, no nocturnal calls. Sleep hard to come by. I found myself glancing out the windows as I read, looking around the dark forest edge. The night seemed normal. Cricket chirps rose from below, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. As August progressed in David's account, his entries grew longer, more detailed, and increasingly personal. August 19th, 2022. First heard it last night, not wolf or coyote. Started like something familiar, but changed into something wrong. Howl lasted 48 seconds, came from about 2 miles NE of tower. Called it in to Robert, who suggested mountain lion. It wasn't a mountain lion. David's certainty made the skin on my arms prickle. I recalled the confident, scientific voice from his early entries. This wasn't a man given to flights of fancy or easy fear. The next pages documented increasingly frequent howling episodes, as David called them. He recorded their duration, direction, and approximate distance with the same precision he had applied to weather patterns. But between these data points, his personal comments grew. August 31st, 2022. Howling from 3 different directions tonight. Marked positions on map, see attached. It's moving closer. Robert insists it's normal wildlife. But he doesn't hear what I hear. The sound is wrong. It copies, but doesn't match. I looked for an attached map, but found nothing. Had it been removed? By September, David's neat handwriting began to waver slightly, the pressure of his pen inconsistent on the page. September 8th, 2022. Saw it today, standing at forest edge directly north of tower. Tall, thin outline. Too tall for human proportions. Stayed still for 7 minutes before going back into trees. I radioed description to Robert, who was sending rangers to check. No one found anything. September 10th, 2022. It was watching me again. Same spot. I used the high-powered binoculars this time. What I saw can't be real. The proportions were wrong. The face I don't want to describe the face. The entries continued, each more disturbing than the last. David described multiple figures showing up at the forest edge, always at dusk or dawn, always watching the tower. He wrote about the forest falling completely quiet for hours, as if all life had run away. Most disturbing were his descriptions of the figures' movements, jerky and too fast, like film running at the wrong speed. By early October, David's writing had changed dramatically. The neat columns of weather data disappeared entirely, replaced by urgent, messy text that sometimes went off the ruled lines. October 3rd, 2022. Found books from the 1920s left by early lookouts. They knew about it. The Wendigo. Spirit of winter, starvation, and cannibalism. Algonquin legends say it possesses humans, making them hunger for their own kind. The more it feeds, the hungrier it becomes, never satisfied. October 8th, 2022. Haven't slept in 50+ hours. They're surrounding the tower now. I counted 7 distinct figures last night. They know I see them. Radio contact spotty. Robert says help is coming, but when? The scratching on the lower stairs started yesterday. The final pages of the logbook contained frantic entries, the handwriting barely legible in places. October 13th, 2022. They're testing the barriers. Something about the tower keeps them at bay, but they're learning. Found symbols carved by previous lookout under desk. Protection marks? Trying to look them up. 3 days without sleep now. October 14th, 2022. It spoke with Mary's voice tonight. Called my name just like she used to. Almost went down to her. Caught myself at the door. Mary's been dead 4 years. They're getting better at tricks. The last entry, dated October 15th, was written in heavy, dark strokes that had torn the paper in places. It's outside. It wants in. If anyone finds this, leave now. They're not human anymore. Never were. The Wendigo gets inside you, changes you, makes you hungry, makes you like them. Can't let that happen. I won't become... The entry cut off mid-sentence. I closed the book slowly, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Isolation did strange things to the mind. I knew this from my own brief periods of solitude after the divorce. How many hours had I spent in my empty apartment imagining I heard Amy's keys in the door, her voice calling from the hallway. Loneliness made you think you saw and heard things that weren't there. David Wilson had been alone on this mountain for nearly 6 months when he wrote those final entries. 6 months with minimal human contact, surrounded by wilderness that could play tricks on the eyes and ears. The man had clearly broken under the strain and made up complicated explanations for ordinary things. I took a breath to steady myself before responding. Copper Mountain here. All clear. No smoke sightings today. Good to hear, Robert replied. Weather system moving in tomorrow afternoon. Expect heavy rain by 1600 hours. Copy that, I said, then hesitated. The question pushed against my teeth until I couldn't hold it back. Robert, I found a logbook from last year's lookout, David Wilson. What happened to him? The radio went silent for long enough that I thought we might have lost connection. When Robert's voice returned, it carried a new tension. That's not really relevant to your duties, Anderson. I'm just curious, I said, trying to sound casual. His log entries stopped suddenly in mid-October. Did he leave early? Another long pause. I could almost feel Robert weighing his response. Wilson abandoned his post without proper notice, he finally said, his tone flat. Search teams found his vehicle at the ranger station, but no sign of Wilson himself. The case remains open. No trace at all? I pressed. What about his personal stuff? Robert's sigh came through the speaker. His tent was found about 2 miles northeast of the tower. Looked like he'd been camping there instead of staying in the lookout. Pack was there, clothes, some food supplies. But no Wilson. Northeast. The the same direction David had reported hearing the first howl. Did he have any history of mental health issues? I asked. His later entries seem troubled. That's not information I'm at liberty to share, Robert replied, his voice cooling further. Lookout duty can be challenging for some individuals. Isolation affects people differently. Of course, I said, trying to backtrack, just trying to understand. Focus on your assigned duties, Anderson. If Wilson's old logbook is distracting you, I can send someone to collect it. No need, I said quickly. It's fine. Just surprised me, that's all. Anything else to report? Robert asked, clearly ready to end the conversation. No, sir. All quiet here. Base out. The radio went quiet. I was alone now, with the darkness outside the windows and the closed logbook in my lap. Outside, the night sounds went on like normal. Crickets chirping, wind moving through pine needles. Just regular wilderness sounds that probably surrounded David Wilson too, until he started hearing something else. I put the logbook in the desk drawer, under some maps. David's story was sad but not surprising. Being alone, the jaw pressure, the endless trees, they could mess with your head, make you paranoid. I'd seen it happen to others, though usually in different places. As I got ready for bed, I tried to forget about David Wilson. His crazy ideas weren't my problem, and thinking about them too much would only make me imagine things too. 6 months was a long time to be alone with your thoughts. Better to keep your head clear. I turned off the lights and lay on my cot, listening to the night. The forest was full of normal sounds, nothing like the strange quiet David had talked about. Tomorrow I would focus on my real job, watching for fires, recording weather data, and keeping the lookout in good shape. David Wilson's story was just that, a story, made up by a lonely, stressed-out man who'd lost touch with reality. At least that's what I told myself as I fell asleep, trying not to think about 7 tall figures surrounding a tower, waiting for their chance to get inside. 2 weeks passed quickly as I settled into my lookout routine. The satisfaction of simple, solitary work was exactly what I needed. Each morning I woke at dawn, made coffee on the propane stove, and started my first perimeter check before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridges. I measured wind speeds, recorded humidity levels, and tracked cloud formations with the kind of attention to detail that would have made my old office manager proud. I'd tucked David Wilson's journal into the bottom desk drawer beneath maps and weather logs. Whatever had happened to the man was unfortunate, but I refused to let his apparent mental breakdown affect my experience here. Isolation affected people differently. Some found peace in it. Others created monsters from shadows. I was determined to be in the first category. The predictable pattern of my days brought a calm I hadn't felt since before the divorce. I hiked nearby trails during the afternoons, ate simple meals while watching spectacular sunsets, and slept better than I had in months. No emails, no lawyers, no well-meaning friends checking if I was doing okay. Until the night I wasn't okay at all. It happened just after 2 a.m. on a clear June night. I woke suddenly, not sure what had pulled me from sleep. The tower was dark except for the dim emergency light near the radio desk. I lay still, listening. The usual night sounds came through the partially open window, wind in the pines, the occasional distant rustle of nocturnal creatures. Then I heard it. The sound started like a normal wolf howl, a long, sad call that bounced across the valley, but halfway through, it changed. The pitch went upward in a way that wolf sounds simply don't. The howl stretched and warped until it sounded almost human. Not quite a scream, not quite a word, but something weirdly in between. I got up and moved to the north window, putting my face close to the glass. The 3/4 moon provided enough light to see the outline of trees at the forest edge, but nothing moved among them. The sound came again, starting as a recognizable animal call before twisting into something wrong. For nearly an hour, I stood at that window, following the sound as it moved around the clearing. Sometimes it seemed to come from the northeast, then minutes later from the northwest, as if whatever made it was circling the tower. Finally, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I checked my watch. The howling stopped mid-cry. The sudden silence felt even more unnerving than the noise. I waited another 30 minutes, but the forest remained quiet. Eventually, I returned to bed, but didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I convinced myself I'd heard a wolf with some kind of injury or problem that affected its vocal cords. Nature produced weird things all the time. In my official log, I wrote simply, 0217 hours, unusual animal vocalization from any quadrant. Possible injured wolf, will report if heard again. During my morning radio check with Robert, I didn't mention it. The last thing I wanted was to sound jumpy or unstable, especially after my questions about David Wilson. The next 2 days passed without incident. I threw myself into my duties with extra energy, as if physical work and focus could erase the memory of that sound. I even hiked farther than usual, following a ridge trail that offered great views of the valley below. The forest felt normal again. Birds called, squirrels darted between trees, and once I spotted a black bear walking through a distant meadow. But 3 nights later, I woke again to the same sound. This time, the howling came from much closer to the tower. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window, pointing the beam across the tree line. The light caught a pair of eyes reflecting back, amber yellow and unblinking. I fumbled with the more powerful spotlight mounted near the desk and aimed it toward the same spot. By the time the stronger beam cut through the darkness, the eyes were gone. But something about their height bothered me. They had been too high off the ground for a wolf, even if standing on its hind legs. Too high even for a mountain lion or bear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I sat in the wooden chair by the north window, flashlight in hand, listening to the howling as it circled the tower again. Like before, it stopped abruptly, this time just before dawn. As soon as daylight filled the sky, I grabbed my hiking boots, pocketed my knife, and headed down the tower steps. The morning air felt cool and clean, but something else waited beneath that freshness, a strange emptiness I couldn't immediately identify. The forest had gone quiet, not completely silent. The wind still moved through pine needles, and occasionally a bird called in the distance. But the normal sounds I'd gotten used to had thinned out a lot. No woodpeckers hammered at trees. No squirrels chattered warnings from branches. Even the constant noise of insects seemed less. I reached the spot where I'd seen the eyes. The ground there showed no tracks that I could identify, though I was hardly an expert tracker. What I did find were broken branches above my head, snapped in a way that suggested something large had moved through the area. The breaks were fresh, still oozing sap. I followed the trail of broken vegetation for about 50 yards before it disappeared into thicker forest. Standing at that boundary, I felt a strong reluctance to go farther. Nothing specific caused it. No sound or sight triggered my hesitation. It was more like an instinct, a basic part of my brain warning me about something I couldn't ignore. I returned to the tower and made a more detailed entry in my log, this time noting both the howling and the unusual quiet I'd seen in the forest. Once again, I skipped mentioning it in my radio check. What would I say? That I heard weird noises and the birds weren't singing enough? Robert already seemed concerned about my interest in David Wilson. I didn't need to give him more reason to question my stability. Over the next week, the change in the forest became impossible to ignore. Each day, the normal noise of wildlife grew less. Fewer birds flew overhead. The squirrels that had practically posed for me during my first weeks had vanished. Even insects seemed scarce, with none of the mosquitoes that should have been bothering me during my hikes. The forest seemed to be losing its wildlife. I started checking the weather reports more frequently, wondering if some atmospheric condition or approaching storm might explain the animal behavior. But the forecasts showed nothing unusual, just the expected summer patterns of occasional afternoon thunderstorms between stretches of clear weather. When Sarah Callahan arrived for her monthly survey, I finally had someone to confirm I wasn't imagining things. She pulled up in her Forest Service truck shortly after noon, getting out with the confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. I watched her approach from my spot on the tower steps, relieved to see another human face after weeks alone. "Matthew Anderson?" she called, shielding her eyes against the sun as she looked up at me. "I'm Sarah Callahan, Wildlife Management." "Nice to meet you," I said, descending the steps to shake her hand. "Robert mentioned you'd be coming." She nodded, glancing around the clearing. "I survey 4 lookout areas monthly during the season. Track wildlife populations, movement patterns, that sort of thing." "You picked a strange time," I said. "The wildlife seems to have taken a vacation." Sarah frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "It's been weirdly quiet the past week or so. Fewer birds, almost no squirrels. Even the insects seem scarce." She pulled a tablet from her backpack and tapped the screen a few times. "Interesting. I need to set up some sound monitoring stations and check a few camera traps. Mind if I use the lookout as home base for the day?" "Be my guest." While Sarah worked, I kept doing my regular duties, looking at the horizons for smoke and writing down weather data. Throughout the day, she came and went, setting up equipment in different spots around the tower. By late afternoon, she came back looking worried. "You're right about the decline in activity," she said, showing me her tablet. "Look at these readings from my last visit compared to today. Bird calls down 60%. Insect activity reduced by nearly half." The screens showed sound wave visualizations and statistical charts I didn't fully understand, but the downward trend was clear. "Any idea what's causing it?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not without more data. Could be seasonal migration patterns changing due to climate change. Could be a predator moving through the area. Even subtle changes in barometric pressure can affect wildlife behavior." "What about larger predators, wolves or mountain lions?" "We don't have active wolf packs in this immediate area," she said. "Mountain lions, yes. But their presence usually changes prey behavior rather than causing broad wildlife declines." Sarah packed up her equipment as the sun began to sink toward the western ridge. "I'll report this to the research team. We might need to increase monitoring frequency if the trend continues." As she headed toward her truck, I nearly told her about the howling, about the eyes in the darkness. But something held me back. Sarah was a scientist, and I had no evidence beyond my own questionable observations in the middle of the night. "Take care up here," she said before driving away. "It can get to you after a while. The isolation." I watched her truck disappear down the access road, leaving a faint trail of dust that quickly settled in the still air. The tower felt lonelier than ever as I climbed the steps back to my small quarters. That evening, after completing my radio check with Robert, I sat at the desk for a long while, staring at the drawer where I'd hidden David Wilson's journal. The connection had been tickling at the back of my mind all day, but I'd resisted making it clear. Finally, I pulled open the drawer and got out the battered logbook. I flipped through the pages until I found the entries from early summer the previous year. I stopped breathing for a second as I read David's detailed notes on wildlife decline, his comments on the unusual quiet that had fallen over the forest, his records of strange howling that began in June. The similarities to my own experiences were too specific to ignore. Whatever had happened in these woods last year was happening again. The thought made me shiver even though the evening was warm. I read further into David's account, finding descriptions of the creatures he claimed to have seen at the forest edge. Tall, thin figures that moved unnaturally fast, the supposed Wendigo that had haunted his final days. Part of me wanted to close the book and go back to my first thought, that David had simply broken under the strain of isolation. But the silence from the forest below, the eyes I'd seen reflecting my flashlight beam, the howling that twisted from animal to something else, these weren't things I could easily explain away. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The tower creaked and settled around me as the temperature dropped. Every sound made me tense. When sleep finally came, it brought no relief. I dreamed of running through endless trees, my lungs burning, my legs heavy with exhaustion. Behind me, something crashed through the bushes, something tall and thin that moved too quickly between the trunks. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt its hunger like it was right behind me. In the dream, I knew for sure that if it caught me, I wouldn't simply die. Something worse waited if those two long fingers closed around my arm. Something that involved becoming like it, joining a hunger that could never be satisfied. I woke gasping for air, my shirt soaked with sweat. Outside the tower windows, the forest stood silent under a cover of stars. I tried hard to hear anything: an owl, a cricket, the rustle of pine needles in the breeze. Nothing. The forest was completely silent, as if waiting for something to come out from the darkness between the trees. July brought a wave of heat to the mountains. I stood on the tower's small deck, wiping sweat from my forehead as I looked around the horizon for the 5th time that day. The temperature had gone past 90 degrees by noon, making the forest very dry with its pine and brittle plants. Fire danger signs throughout the region had been updated to extreme, and I felt the responsibility of my job more than ever. The radio crackled to life beside me. "Copper Mountain, this is base. We've got your smoke report. Coordinates confirmed. Response team is en route." I picked up the handset. "Copy that, base. Smoke is still visible from my position. Looks like a single point of origin. Probably lightning strike from last night's dry storm." "Keep us updated on any changes," Robert replied. "Winds picking up from the southwest. Could spread fast in these conditions." "Will do." I watched through binoculars as a helicopter showed up 20 minutes later, flying over the exact spot I'd given them before dropping water on the small fire. 2 more passes, and the thin column of smoke I'd spotted started to clear up. The fire team worked fast. They'd put out 2 other small fires this week. When I was sure everything was under control, I grabbed my water bottle and went down the tower steps. I needed to check the ground around the area after each fire report, making sure no new fires had started nearby. The wooden steps made noise under my boots as I went down. Each step took me closer to the forest edge. I stopped at the bottom, looking at the clearing in front of me. Nothing moved in the midday heat. No wind in the pine needles, no birds singing from the trees. I told myself this was normal. Heat often made animals hide and rest during the hottest part of the day. But as I walked around the clearing, looking for any signs of smoke or fire, the quiet was strange. No squirrels ran between trees. No jays made noise from the branches above. Even the usual buzzing of insects had gotten really quiet. The forest seemed empty, like all the animals had left. I finished my check quickly, wanting to get back to the tower. As I turned back, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the trees, but it disappeared so fast I couldn't be sure it was anything. I kept looking at that spot, waiting to see if it would come back, but nothing moved. Back in the tower, I told Base the fire had been put out. I didn't tell them about the quiet forest or what I might have seen. Those things were for my personal log, not official reports. That night, the howling started again. I'd been falling asleep in my chair with a book open on my lap when the sound cut through the darkness. It began the same way as always, a normal wolf howl that changed halfway through, turning into something that made my arms get goosebumps. I grabbed my phone from the desk and started recording, catching the weird sound as it bounced across the valley. The howling kept going for nearly an hour, moving around the edge of the clearing just like before. Each time I heard it, it seemed a little closer to the tower than the night before. I tried to spot whatever was making the sound through each window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. When morning came, I played the recording during my check-in with Robert. "Listen to this," I said, holding my phone to the radio microphone. The distorted howl filled the small tower room, sounding even more unnatural through the radio's speaker. When the recording ended, Robert was silent for several seconds. "Could be a mountain lion," he finally said. "They sometimes make unusual vocalizations, especially during mating season." "This doesn't sound like any mountain lion I've ever heard," I replied. "Coyotes, then. They can make some pretty strange noises when they hunt in packs." I could hear the doubt in his voice. He was offering explanations he didn't believe himself. "Whatever it is, it's getting closer to the tower every night," I said. "Anderson." Robert's tone shifted, becoming more formal. "How are you holding up?" "Isolation can play tricks on the mind, make normal things seem abnormal." "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. "Just curious about the wildlife. If you need a supply run or check-in visit, I can arrange something." "Sarah's not scheduled to return until August, but no need," I interrupted. "I'm good, really." After signing off, I sat at the desk, staring at the phone in my hand. The recorded howl was proof I wasn't imagining things, but it explained nothing. I put the phone away and tried to focus on my regular duties. The heat kept going for days, making the forest dry and on edge. I reported 2 more small fires, watching from up high as teams put them out before they could spread. Each time, I did the required ground check with more and more hesitation, feeling exposed and watched as I walked around the tower's base. I couldn't sleep well. I dozed off and on, often jerking awake, sure someone was outside my window. I knew this couldn't happen. The tower was 40 feet above the ground, but fear doesn't listen to logic. It reacted to the silence, to the howling, to the feeling that something in the forest had changed. One morning, after a really bad night, I went down the tower steps for my daily check and stopped suddenly. There, on the lowest wooden steps, were deep scratches that weren't there the day before. 4 parallel grooves cut into the wood, too big for a squirrel or raccoon, too precise to be an accident. I knelt to look at them, feeling the splintered edges. The cuts were fresh, the wood still light-colored where it had been cut open. Whatever made them was really strong. The grooves were nearly half an inch deep in the hard wood. I took out my phone and took pictures of the scratches from different angles, showing their size and depth before the weather could wear them away. As I stood up, I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see something watching me from the edge of the forest. But the forest stayed still and quiet. Back in the tower, I added this to my growing list of weird things happening. The list began small, the first howling, the unusual quiet, but now covered several pages with dates, times, and descriptions. Seeing it all listed in order made the pattern clear. Whatever was happening wasn't random, it was getting worse. That night, I found myself talking out loud as I made dinner on the small propane stove. "Need to check those coordinates again," I muttered, stirring a pot of beans. "Southeast quadrant's been too quiet." I caught myself answering in a slightly different tone. Probably nothing there anyway. Same as yesterday. The sound of my own voice in the silent tower surprised me. I set down the spoon and took a deep breath. Talking to yourself wasn't unusual in isolation. I'd done it occasionally, even back in Seattle. But carrying on a conversation with myself was different. It suggested a mind-seeking company where none existed. After dinner, I pulled David Wilson's journal from the drawer where I'd been keeping it. What had started as occasional reference had become nightly reading. Each time I opened the old logbook, I noticed things I'd missed before. Small notes in margins, symbols drawn beside certain entries, patterns in his observations that matched my own experiences with scary accuracy. Tonight, I focused on a section I'd previously skipped over. In late July of the previous year, David had begun mapping the locations of his strange occurrences. The howling, the sightings of figures at the forest edge, the unusual animal behavior. He'd used a standard Forest Service topographical map marking each incident with a small X in the date. I pulled out my own copy of the same map and began transferring my observations. The direction of the howling each night, the location where I'd seen movement at the tree line, the scratches on the tower steps. As the marks added up, a pattern emerged that made my stomach tighten. The incidents formed a rough circle around the tower, just as David's had. The circle had started wide, with events occurring far from my position, but gradually moved closer over time, getting nearer to the tower with each new occurrence. I laid my map beside David's open journal. The similarity was clear. Whatever had happened to David Wilson last year was happening to me now, following the same pattern, getting closer and closer. The connections became too strong to ignore. Either I was unconsciously copying David's experiences after reading his journal, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, or something real was happening in these woods, something that followed a pattern. I stayed up late that night, comparing my notes with David's, looking for any detail that might explain what was happening. The more I read, the more convinced I became that David hadn't simply broken under the strain of isolation. His observations were too specific, too consistent, too similar to what I was experiencing now. Around midnight, the howling began again. I moved to the window, phone ready to record. The sound came from directly below the tower this time, so close I could almost feel it through the floorboards. I pressed record and waited, listening as the howl changed from animal to something else, something that knew my name. I nearly dropped the phone. The sound hadn't formed words exactly, but in the warping of the howl, I could have sworn I heard Matt called in a voice that was both familiar and wrong. I backed away from the window. The reasons I'd come up with: injured wolves, mountain lions, the tricks of wind through rock formations, didn't hold up anymore after hearing that almost voice. Whatever was out there knew me. It was calling to me. I spent the rest of the night in the chair by the radio desk with my rifle, watching the windows for any sign of movement. The howling continued on and off until just before dawn, always from directly below the tower, always with that hint of my name hidden in its strange notes. When morning finally came, I made my radio check with Robert, reporting all clear even though I was exhausted, and it made my voice rough. I didn't mention the howling or the way it had seemed to speak. I didn't tell him about the maps or the pattern or the scratches. The words formed in my mind but died before reaching my lips. Instead, I asked, "Robert, did David Wilson ever report hearing unusual sounds? Animal noises that didn't sound quite right?" The pause before his answer told me everything. "Anderson," he finally said, "I think you need to focus on your assigned duties. Fire season's hitting its peak. We need your eyes clear and your mind sharp." "I am focused," I insisted. "I'm just curious about—" "Curiosity about Wilson isn't helping you do your job," Robert cut in. "Let it go. The man abandoned his post. End of story." But it wasn't the end. It was happening again, following the same pattern, moving toward the same conclusion. As I looked at the maps spread across my desk, David's marked with his neat handwriting, mine with my increasingly messy notes, I knew I was walking the same path David had taken last summer. The question was whether I could change the ending. August arrived with heavy heat that dried out the forest. The temperature had been climbing steadily for weeks, but now it settled into a harsh pattern that made everything dry and ready to burn. I spent my mornings checking and rechecking the fire danger indicators, watching as the needle pushed further into the red zone each day. My routine had changed. I still did all my required duties, looking around the horizons for smoke, recording weather data, maintaining regular radio contact with base. But now I did these things automatically. My attention split between the job I was sent here to do and the growing worry that filled my nights. The howling had become a regular occurrence. Sometimes it started just after sunset. Other times it waited until the deepest part of night, when even the nocturnal creatures had gone quiet. I'd given up trying to record it or track where it came from. The sound was coming from everywhere now, as if the forest itself had found a voice that knew my name. I hadn't been sleeping well. My dreams were full of trees and the feeling of being hunted. I'd wake gasping for breath, convinced something stood just outside my window, watching and waiting. The tower felt safe, but also like a trap. Nothing could reach me up here, but if something did, I had nowhere to run. On the third night of August, a storm rolled in from the west. I watched it approach from my lookout, following the massive thunderheads as they built over the distant peaks. Lightning flashed inside the clouds. Under different circumstances, I might have found it pretty. The storm hit just after midnight with a force that shook the tower. Rain hit the windows in horizontal sheets while wind howled around the corners of the small cabin. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, followed almost immediately by thunder that rattled the glass. I sat at the desk, recording the storm's progress in my log. The Weather Service had issued warnings about dry lightning, strikes that could start fires despite the rain if they hit in just the right spot. My job was to note any suspicious flashes and their locations, ready to report new fires as soon as the storm passed. A particularly bright flash lit up the entire clearing. In that moment of electric daylight, I saw it. A figure standing at the forest edge, tall and strangely thin. It stood completely still despite the wind that bent the surrounding pines nearly double. The image stayed with me for the split second before darkness returned. I grabbed the spotlight mounted near the desk and pointed it toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. The beam cut through the rain, showing empty space where the silhouette had stood. I moved the light back and forth along the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but found nothing. For the rest of the night, I kept the spotlight ready, pointing it at the forest edge whenever lightning showed the clearing. The figure didn't appear again, but I couldn't shake the certainty of what I'd seen. A human shape, too tall and too thin, watching the tower through the storm. When morning came, I made my decision. I couldn't continue like this. The lack of sleep, the constant watchfulness, the growing certainty that something was out there. It was affecting my ability to do my job. I needed to leave, even if just for a few days to clear my head. I waited until my scheduled check-in with Robert before making the request. "Base, this is Copper Mountain. I need to request emergency leave." The radio crackled with static before Robert's voice came through. "Copper Mountain, what's the nature of your emergency?" I hesitated. What could I say? That I'd seen a shape in a lightning flash? That I was being stalked by something that howled my name in the night? "Family emergency," I lied. "I just need 3 days. I can be back by the weekend." The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know before Robert even spoke. "Negative, Anderson. We're at peak fire season with 3 active burns in the region. All personnel are on essential duty status. No leave approvals until September at the earliest." "Robert, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Is there a medical issue I should know about?" His tone shifted slightly, professional concern replacing the bureaucratic response. "Again, I paused, telling him about what I'd seen, about the howling, about how sure I was that something was wrong in these woods. It would sound like the crazy talk of someone going nuts. Exactly how David Wilson must have sounded last year. "No," I said finally. "No medical issue, just something I need to take care of." "Then I'm sorry, but the request is denied. We're short-staffed as it is. The Elk Ridge fire has pulled half our response teams to the north." I wanted to argue, to insist, but what leverage did I have? I'd signed a contract for the full season. Breaking it without approval would mean not just losing the job, but potentially facing penalties. "Understood," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Hang in there, Anderson. Fire season usually breaks by mid-September. We can talk about rotation then if you still need time." After signing off, I sat at the radio desk for a long time, looking at the handset. Mid-September was 6 weeks away. 6 more weeks of nights filled with howling, of figures at the forest edge, of slowly unraveling under the strain of whatever was happening here. I pulled David Wilson's journal from the drawer where I kept it. The book fell open naturally to the final pages, the ones I'd been reading obsessively for days. David's frantic handwriting filled the margins, describing the figures he'd seen watching the tower. Always the same shape, he'd written. Tall, impossibly thin. They stand perfectly still for hours. When they move, it's wrong. Too fast, too jerky, like watching film frames skipping. The description matched exactly what I'd seen in the lightning flash. Not a tree moved by wind, but a figure. Someone that stood and watched with purpose. 3 nights later, it came back. I was doing a final check through the windows before trying to sleep when I saw it. The same tall, thin shape, standing at exactly the same spot where it had appeared during the storm. The night was clear now, with a 3/4 moon giving enough light to see the tree line clearly. The figure stood still, a dark shape against the darkness of the forest. I grabbed my binoculars, but even with them, I couldn't see any details. Just a human-shaped outline that seemed too tall, its proportions a bit off in ways I couldn't quite explain. I reached for the spotlight, but something stopped me. I was sure that lighting up the figure would only confirm what I already knew and make real something I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I watched it through the binoculars as the minutes turned into hours. The figure never moved. It stood completely still, like it had all the time in the world, like waiting was what it was meant to do. Just before dawn, I must have fallen asleep in the chair by the window. When I woke up suddenly, the figure was gone, leaving me wondering if it had been there at all or if I was just too tired and imagined it. My rifle, which had been in the cabinet under the desk, now stayed loaded and close by at all times. I told myself this was normal for someone alone in the wilderness. Mountain lions sometimes came near towers. Bears sometimes checked out human buildings looking for food. But I knew what I was really afraid of wasn't any normal animal. The days ran together in a blur of heat and watching. I did my job without thinking much, looking for smoke, writing down weather info, making my radio calls to base. But I was really focused on the edge of the forest, looking for any sign that the figure would come back. I kept reading David's final notes over and over, looking for hints, for warnings, for some explanation of what had happened to him and what was happening to me. His descriptions got more detailed as his entries went on. The figures coming closer to the tower each night, testing limits, watching like they were hungry but patient. "They're not human," he'd written in one of his last coherent entries. "They wear human shapes like ill-fitting clothes. Something else looks out through those eyes." I tried to dismiss his words as the product of isolation and fear, but each night, as I watched the forest edge, I knew he was right. Whatever was out there watching the tower, it wasn't human. It had never been human. Sarah's August visit brought some relief from my loneliness. I saw her Forest Service truck coming up the access road late one morning and felt really happy. Having another person around, someone real and normal, was exactly what I needed. She looked concerned when she saw me. "You okay, Anderson? You look like you haven't slept in days." I gave a quick smile. August heat makes it hard to get comfortable at night. Sarah nodded, though her expression remained doubtful. "I need to check my monitoring stations. The wildlife decline we noted last month has continued. Headquarters wants more data." I helped her unload equipment from her truck, happy to have something to do and someone to talk to about normal things instead of what I'd been seeing at night. We worked together through the afternoon, retrieving data from the monitoring devices she'd placed around the tower and setting up additional sensors. "The readings are strange," she said as we reviewed the data on her tablet. "It's not just reduced activity, it's a specific pattern of avoidance. The animals aren't just quieter, they're staying away from certain areas entirely." She showed me a map on her screen where she'd plotted wildlife movements based on camera trap data. The pattern was clear, a roughly circular area around the tower where almost no animal activity had been recorded. "Any theories?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Could be a predator establishing territory. But usually that creates different movement patterns. Prey species become more vigilant but don't abandon areas completely." She frowned at the screen. "I've never seen avoidance this complete before." I nearly told her then, about the howling, about the person I'd seen, about David's journal and its descriptions of creatures that weren't human. The words were right there, desperate to be spoken, to be shared with someone who might understand or at least not dismiss them immediately. But then Sarah looked up from her tablet, looking at my face with professional concern. "Matthew, I have to ask, are you doing all right up here? You seem tense, not sleeping well from the looks of it." And just like that, the moment passed. I knew how it would sound if I started talking about someone watching the tower or howling that spoke my name. She'd nod sympathetically while mentally writing up her report about the lookout going crazy from being alone too long. "I'm fine," I said, "just taking the job seriously. Fire danger's at its peak right now." "Well, make sure you're taking care of yourself, too. Lookout duty is important, but not at the expense of your health." She left before sunset, promising to return in September with a better monitoring plan. I watched her truck go down the access road feeling empty. My one chance to talk to someone about what was happening was gone because I couldn't explain it without sounding crazy. That night, the figure showed up again. This time, it wasn't alone. A second shape stood beside it at the forest edge. Another tall, thin figure just as unnaturally still. I looked at them through the binoculars while my hands shook as I tried to focus. They stood exactly the same distance apart, exactly the same height, like they came from the same mold. Then, for the first time, one of them moved. The figure on the left took a single step forward, out of the tree line and into the clearing. The movement wasn't smooth. It jumped forward like someone had cut frames from a video. One moment it was at the forest edge, the next a foot beyond it with nothing in between. I grabbed the rifle. The figure took another jumpy step forward, then another. It moved straight toward the tower with that same stop-motion movement, covering ground in a way that didn't look natural. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The figure froze about 30 yards from the tower base, like it had hit a barrier it couldn't cross. It just stood there, completely still, while its companions stayed at the forest edge. They stayed that way until dawn, one at the tree line, one in the clearing, both watching the tower with endless patience. When the first light of morning touched the clearing, they were gone, with no tracks or signs they'd been there. I sat by the window long after they'd disappeared, rifle across my lap, wondering what would have happened if the figure had kept coming. Would it have climbed the tower steps? Would it have tried to get in? What was the invisible boundary that stopped it, and how long would that boundary last? The questions kept spinning in my mind with no answers, just the growing feeling that whatever David Wilson faced last year had come back. And it was testing its limits, checking for weak spots, learning how close it could get. I looked down at the rifle in my lap and wondered if bullets would stop something that moved like broken video and disappeared at dawn. I wondered if anything would stop it once it decided to do more than just watch. By September, I barely slept. My body needed rest, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The tall, thin shapes at the forest edge, watching with weird stillness. I'd started napping during the day, 20 or 30 minutes at a time, sitting up in the wooden chair with my rifle across my lap. It wasn't enough, but it kept me going. The tower had become my cage. I did my job without thinking, looking for smoke, writing down weather data, keeping the equipment working, but I was really focused on the tree line, watching for movement, for things that didn't belong. The shape showed up every night now. Sometimes it stood alone at the edge of the clearing. Other nights, it brought friends, 2, 3, sometimes as many as 7 matching shapes spaced evenly along where the forest began. They never came closer during darkness, just watching from a distance that seemed to get smaller each time. I'd stopped writing in my official log about the shapes or the howling. Those notes went into a separate notebook I kept hidden under my mattress, away from any visiting Forest Service people who might question if I was crazy. I wrote down times, locations, movements, anything that might show a pattern I could use to understand what was happening. My radio calls with Robert became less frequent. I made the required morning and evening calls but kept them short and normal, only telling him what I had to. I worried about what he might hear in my voice, the tiredness, the exhaustion, the panic I tried to hide. "Copper Mountain, this is base. How are conditions up there?" Robert asked during one evening check. "Clear visibility, no smoke. Fire danger remains extreme," I replied, keeping my voice flat. "Anderson, you sound tired. Everything all right?" "Just the usual. Long days watching for smoke. September's almost here. Fire season should start winding down soon." I didn't tell him that fire was the least of my concerns now. I didn't mention that I'd started dreaming about David Wilson. Dreams where he stood at the foot of my cot, his face stretched into an impossible smile, whispering words I couldn't quite hear. "Copy that," I said instead. "Copper Mountain out." The nights grew longer as summer began its slow surrender to fall. Temperatures dropped, especially after sunset, bringing a chill that came through the tower windows. I welcomed the cold. It helped keep me alert during the long hours of watching and waiting. On the night of September 7th, everything changed. I was at the desk, updating my hidden journal with the day's observations, when the howling began. It started as it always did, a recognizable wolf call that twisted halfway through into something else, something that sounded almost human, but not quite. But tonight, it came from multiple directions at once, as if a group of creatures surrounded the tower. I went to the north window, then the east, then the south, tracking the sounds as they rang across the clearing. The howls overlapped, creating a mix of sounds that gave me goosebumps. I counted at least 5 different voices, maybe more, each calling from a different position around the tower. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the howling stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the moment before a storm hits. I grabbed the spotlight and pointed it across the clearing. The beam showed nothing but empty space and the dark wall of trees beyond. I was about to turn away when movement at the tower base caught my attention. A figure stood directly below me, at the foot of the wooden stairs. I jerked in shock as I pointed the spotlight on it. For the first time, I could see details beyond just a shadow. It wore what looked like torn clothing, the remains of a Forest Service uniform, the green fabric faded and ripped. Its body was very thin, almost like a skeleton, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. I grabbed my binoculars for a closer look. Through them, I could see more. Pale skin stretched too tight over sharp bones, hands with fingers that looked more like claws, and a face that was almost but not quite human. The figure didn't move or react to the spotlight. It just stood there, looking up at the tower. Something inside me snapped. Weeks of fear, of watching and waiting, of questioning if I was going crazy. It all turned into a sudden, desperate need to face whatever had been scaring me. I needed answers, needed to know what I was up against, even if finding out was dangerous. I grabbed my rifle and checked that it was loaded. I clipped a flashlight to my belt and tucked my hunting knife into its sheath. My hands shook as I got ready, but my mind felt strangely calm, focused by making a decision. The wooden steps made noise under my weight as I went down the tower. Each step took me closer to the figure, which stayed still at the bottom. My breathing got faster in the quiet night. The rifle was in my hands as I continued downward. When I reached the final landing, 10 feet above the ground, I stopped. From here, I could see the figure clearly in the beam of my flashlight. It stood perfectly still, its back to me, facing the dark forest beyond. "Who are you?" My voice sounded strange in my ears, hoarse from disuse. The figure didn't respond immediately. It stayed still for a few seconds before slowly turning to face me. I almost dropped my flashlight when I saw its face. It had human features, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were all wrong. The skin was too tight across the cheekbones, the eyes were too far apart, and the mouth was too wide for such a narrow face. What terrified me most was that I recognized it. Despite the distortion, I knew that face. I'd seen it in Forest Service personnel files when I was looking up info on my predecessor. The figure smiled, showing too many teeth lined up in rows that no normal human mouth would have. "I'm David," it said in a voice that cracked from disuse, the sound like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "I've been trying to warn you." I raised the rifle, aiming at the center of its chest. "You're not David Wilson." The figure, the thing that claimed to be David, tilted its head at an angle that no human neck should allow. "Not anymore. Not entirely." Its voice changed as it spoke, starting as a human sound, but sliding into something else. Something that sounded like the howling I'd been hearing for months. "What happened to the real David Wilson?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. The person laughed, the sound exactly copying the howling that had bothered me all summer. "I am the real David Wilson, what's left of him." He pointed to himself with hands that had black, claw-like nails. "This is what happens when you stay too long, when you listen too closely to the forest." "What are you?" I tightened my grip on the rifle. "You know what I am. You've read my journal. You've heard the stories." The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. The Algonquin had a name for it, the Wendigo, the spirit of winter, of hunger that can never be satisfied. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of the rifle carried across the clearing, but the person didn't flinch or react. Instead, they stepped closer, still with that creepy smile on their face. The Wendigo got inside me. It whispered, close enough now that I could smell its breath, cold and rotten, like meat left too long in the snow. "It gets inside everyone here eventually. It's patient. It has all the time in the world." I backed up a step, my boot finding the edge of the stair behind me. "Stay back. I tried to warn you," the thing that had been David Wilson said. "The scratches on the stairs, the howling. I was trying to make you leave before it was too late." It looked almost sad for a moment, an expression that sat wrong on its distorted features. "But it's already too late, isn't it? You've seen them. You've heard them calling your name." It took another step toward me, hand outstretched as if in offering. "You could join us willingly. It hurts less that way." The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was talking to a hallucination born of isolation and fear. But my gut knew the truth. Whatever stood before me wasn't human anymore, and it wanted something from me that I wouldn't give. I raised the rifle again, aiming directly at the center of its chest. I said, "Stay back." The thing paused, its too wide smile never fading. "You can't kill what's already dead, Matthew, and you can't run from what's already inside you." My finger tightened on the trigger. "I'm not David. I won't become what you are. We'll see," it whispered. It jumped forward with that same jerky, too-fast movement I'd noticed from a distance. I fired directly at its chest, the sound deafening in the night air. The thing fell backward when I shot it, crumpling to the ground with a sound like breaking branches. I stood frozen on the stairs, rifle still raised, waiting for it to move again. When it remained still, I descended the final steps, approaching carefully with my flashlight pointed at the spot where it had fallen. Where the body should have been, I found only a dark stain on the dirt. Something that might have been blood, but looked wrong, too thick and too dark. A trail of the substance led away from the impact point, disappearing into the trees. I followed the trail with my flashlight, tracking it across the clearing. The dark liquid shined in the beam, leaving a clear path toward the forest edge. At the tree line, I stopped. Everything in me warned against following the trail into the darkness beyond. I pointed my light among the trees, lighting up the first few yards of forest, but the trail continued deeper than my beam could reach. I took a single step past the tree line, then stopped. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, no small animals moving through the bushes. The silence was overwhelming, warning me better than words could have. I backed away, returning to the tower with quick, careful steps, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. The clearing felt exposed, vulnerable. I thought eyes were watching from every shadow. Back inside the tower, I locked the door and pushed the small refrigerator in front of it. I dragged the desk away from the wall and positioned it against the windows on the north side, where the things most often appeared. It wasn't much of a barricade, but it made me feel a bit safer. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the wooden chair with my rifle across my lap, watching the tree line through the windows I hadn't blocked. The forest remained dark and still, showing no sign of the thing I'd shot or its companions, but I knew they were out there, watching and waiting. As the first hint of dawn brightened the eastern sky, the forest erupted with howling. Not just one voice, but many, a chorus of creatures surrounding the tower from all directions. The sound rose and fell in waves, sometimes recognizable as wolf calls, sometimes changing into something that sounded like human screams. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to go directly into my brain. Within all the noise, I could almost make out words. My name, repeated over and over, and other phrases too distorted to understand. The howling continued until the sun cleared the horizon, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a silence that felt almost as heavy. When full daylight arrived, I made radio contact with base. My voice broke as I reported what had happened, describing it as a confrontation with a trespasser. "I fired a warning shot," I said, omitting the fact that my second shot had been aimed to kill. "They ran into the forest. I couldn't identify them in the dark." Robert's response came quickly, concern evident in his voice. "Are you injured? Did they attempt to enter the tower?" "No, I'm fine. They didn't get inside." "I'll send rangers to investigate," Robert promised. "But it might take a day or two. We've got a major wildfire in the next county that's pulled most of our personnel." "I understand," I said, though the thought of waiting days for help made my stomach tighten. "I'll maintain regular contact. Anderson, Robert's voice turned serious. "If this person returns, do not engage. Lock yourself in the tower and radio immediately. That's an order. That's—" "Copy that," I replied, knowing I'd already broken that protocol in the worst possible way. After signing off, I sat at the desk, staring at the handset. I hadn't told Robert everything, not about the figure claiming to be David Wilson, not about its inhuman appearance, not about the dark substance that had leaked from its wound instead of blood. Those details would have raised questions about my mental state, questions I couldn't afford if I wanted to be taken seriously. The day passed very slowly. I performed my duties mechanically, looking for smoke, recording weather data, making the required radio checks. But my attention stayed fixed on the forest edge, watching for any sign of movement, any hint that the figures were returning. As evening came closer, I got more and more worried. Would they come back after I'd shot one of them? Would they try to get back at me? These questions kept running through my head with no answers, just making me more nervous. Night fell, and the figures returned. They showed up one by one along the forest edge, tall, thin shapes standing completely still, watching the tower. I counted 7 of them, spaced evenly around the clearing, making a complete circle around me. They didn't try to come closer. They just stood and watched, and somehow their stillness was scarier than if they'd done something. I knew what they were doing, trying to mess with my head. They were trying to wear me down, breaking my determination by constantly watching me and making me wonder what might happen if I stopped paying attention. I thought about leaving my post, packing some supplies and trying to hike to the ranger station. But thinking about what might be waiting for me in the forest kept me from going anywhere. It seemed better to face the danger I could see than whatever might be hiding in the trees. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I wrote everything down. I picked up where David's journal had ended, writing about what happened to me, the things I saw, and how I was starting to understand what had happened to him and what was happening to me. As I wrote, everything started making sense. The wildlife avoiding the area, the weird silence, the figures that moved like broken film frames, the howling that said my name. It all created a picture of something very old and hungry that had claimed these woods as its own. I understood now what had happened to David Wilson. He hadn't abandoned his post or gotten lost in the wilderness. He had become something else, something that wasn't human anymore. And now that same fate was after me, patient and relentless, waiting for me to make a mistake or just get worn out from being scared all the time. Outside my windows, the 7 figures stayed perfectly still, their shapes barely visible against the darkness of the forest. They would wait all night, I knew, and they would return tomorrow night, and the night after that, slowly closing the circle until I had nowhere left to run. I continued writing, putting down everything while I still could, while I still remembered who and what I was. The night stretched ahead, long and dark, filled with watchers who had all the time in the world. The person fell backward when I shot it, dropping to the ground with a sound like breaking branches. I stood frozen on the stairs, rifle still raised, waiting for it to move again. Seconds felt like minutes. The clearing stayed quiet except for the fading sound of the gunshot. When the body didn't move, I made myself go down the stairs. I walked slowly, keeping the rifle aimed, my finger near the trigger, ready to fire again if I needed to. "David!" I called, immediately regretting giving it a name. No response came from the crumpled body. I moved closer, pointing my flashlight across the ground. The light showed something dark and wet shining in the dirt, a stain where the body should have been. It looked like blood, but wrong somehow. Too thick, too dark, almost black in the light. My stomach turned at the sight and the smell that rose from it. Something rotten and cold, like meat left too long in a freezer. A trail of the stuff led away from the impact point, a series of dark droplets that disappeared into the trees. I followed my flashlight, tracking the path across the clearing. The trail was clear, heading straight for the forest edge. At the tree line, I stopped. I really didn't want to follow that trail into the darkness. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling, no small animals moving through the bushes. Just absolute, weird quiet. I took a deep breath and stepped forward anyway. The trail continued between the trees, dark droplets catching the light of my flashlight. I followed for about 50 yards, moving slowly, stopping every few feet to listen and look around me. The trees grew thicker here, their branches making a cover that blocked the moonlight. My flashlight seemed to grow weaker the deeper I went. Then, abruptly, the trail ended. The last dark droplet shined on a fallen log, and beyond that, nothing. I moved my light in widening circles, looking for any sign of where the figure had gone, but found only undisturbed forest floor. A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I whipped around, rifle raised, but saw nothing. Another crack came from behind me, then another from my right. The sounds surrounded me, coming from all directions at once. I backed away, retracing my steps toward the clearing. The sounds followed, always just out of sight, always moving. Something was circling me, testing me, hurting me. When I broke through the tree line back into the clearing, I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the tower steps, taking them 2 at a time, breathing hard with each breath. Only when I reached the door did I turn to look at the forest edge. Nothing moved among the trees. The clearing lay empty and still under the moonlight, but I knew I wasn't alone. Inside the tower, I locked the door and dragged the small refrigerator in front of it. The metal scraped against the wooden floor as I pushed, the sound really loud in the quiet cabin. I moved to the windows next, pulling the desk away from the wall and positioning it against the north-facing panes, where the figures most often appeared. The barricade was flimsy at best, but it gave me something to do, some illusion of security. I checked and rechecked my rifle, counting the remaining ammunition. 5 rounds in the magazine, 23 more in the box. Not enough if what waited outside came in numbers. Not enough if bullets even worked against them at all. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the wooden chair with my rifle across my lap, watching the tree line through the windows I hadn't blocked. Hours passed in tense silence. The forest remained dark and still, showing no sign of the thing I'd shot or its friends, but I felt their presence, patient, watching, waiting. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, the forest erupted with howling, not just one voice but many, a chorus of creatures surrounding the tower from all directions. The sound rose and fell in waves, sometimes recognizable as wolf calls, sometimes shifting into something that sounded like human screams. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to go directly into my brain. Within the noise, I could almost make out words. My name, repeated over and over, and other phrases too distorted to understand. The howling continued until the sun cleared the horizon, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a silence that felt almost as heavy. When full daylight arrived, I made radio contact with base. My hands shook as I held the handset, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could trust my voice. Base, this is Copper Mountain. Do you copy? Over. Static crackled for several seconds before Robert's voice came through. Copper Mountain, this is Base. Go ahead. I need to report an incident. My voice broke as I spoke, the words catching in my throat. There was a trespasser at the tower last night. I fired a warning shot. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that my second shot had been aimed to kill, that I had fired directly at something that looked human, but wasn't. That I had followed a trail of black blood into the forest and found nothing. "Are you injured?" Robert's voice sharpened with concern. "Did they attempt to enter the tower?" "No, I'm fine. They didn't get inside." I swallowed hard. They ran into the forest. I couldn't identify them in the dark. "I'll send rangers to investigate," Robert promised, "but it might take a day or two. We've got a major wildfire in the next county that's pulled most of our personnel." My stomach tightened at the thought of waiting days for help. "I understand. I'll maintain regular contact." "Anderson," Robert's voice turned serious. "If this person returns, do not engage. Lock yourself in the tower and radio immediately. That's an order." "Copy that," I replied, knowing I'd already broken that protocol in the worst possible way. After signing off, I sat at the desk, looking at the phone. I hadn't told Robert everything, not about the figure claiming to be David Wilson, not about its inhuman appearance, not about the dark substance that had leaked from its wound instead of blood. Those details would have raised questions about my mental state, questions I couldn't afford if I wanted to be taken seriously. I tried to eat, but couldn't keep food down. My stomach rejected the simple meal I made, sending me rushing to the small bathroom to throw up. I felt really tired after everything that happened, but I fought to stay awake. I couldn't risk closing my eyes, not when I knew what waited outside. 2 days had passed since I'd shot the thing claiming to be David Wilson. 2 days of being trapped in the tower, surrounded by figures that never approached but never left. They stood at the forest edge in daylight now, no longer hiding in darkness. 7 tall, thin shapes spaced evenly around the clearing, watching with endless patience. I'd tried the radio again and again, calling for Robert or anyone at base who might hear me. Each try gave me only static or silence. No one answered, not even to let me know they got my messages. The silence seemed on purpose, like something was blocking the signal, or like base had decided to stop answering. My supplies were running low. I'd rationed what was left of my food, eating just enough to keep going. Water wasn't a problem yet. The rain barrel was nearly full from a recent storm. But I was hungry all the time. I only slept in short bursts, 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there, never enough to really rest, but just enough to keep me going. Each time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of running through endless trees, chased by something I couldn't see but knew was getting closer with every step. On the morning of the 3rd day, I woke to a sound that jolted me awake, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. I jumped to my feet, almost knocking over the chair I'd been dozing in, and rushed to the window. The sound grew louder, more clear. Not my imagination, not a trick of the wind, a real helicopter coming from the south. I felt so relieved I almost fell over. Help was coming. Someone had heard my calls, or Robert had gotten worried about my silence and sent a team to check on me. Either way, I wasn't alone anymore. I grabbed my binoculars and looked around the sky, trying to find where the sound was coming from. It took a few tries before I spotted it. A small dot against the blue, getting bigger as it got closer. I could see the Forest Service logo on its side as it came nearer, the familiar green and white markings I'd seen on the helicopter that brought me here months ago. But something was wrong. The helicopter wasn't heading straight to the tower like I thought it would. Instead, it turned east, following a path that would take it past me without stopping. "No," I whispered, watching its trajectory with growing dread. "No, come this way." I grabbed the radio, pressing the transmit button with shaking fingers. "Helicopter, this is Copper Mountain Fire Lookout. Do you copy? Over." Static answered me, the same dead air I'd been getting for 2 days. I tried again, practically shouting into the handset. "This is Copper Mountain. I need immediate evacuation. Do you copy?" Nothing. The helicopter continued on its course, now clearly visible through my binoculars, but showing no sign of changing direction. It wasn't coming for me. It was heading somewhere else entirely. I kept the binoculars trained on it, Following its path as it moved east of the tower, the helicopter slowed and began circling an area about 2 miles away, hovering over a section of forest I recognized from my maps, the same area where David Wilson's tent had been found last year, according to Robert. I suddenly realized what was happening. They weren't searching for me. They were searching for David again, continuing a hunt that had begun last summer and never officially ended. Through my binoculars, I could make out figures on the ground, search teams in Forest Service uniforms moving through the trees in organized patterns. They carried equipment, probably the same gear they'd used in their previous searches. They were looking in exactly the wrong place, unaware that what remained of David Wilson had been standing outside my tower for weeks. I lowered the binoculars and looked toward the forest edge. The figures had retreated into the trees, no longer visible along the perimeter. The helicopter's presence had driven them back, at least temporarily. This might be my only chance. I ran to the supply cabinet and grabbed the emergency flare gun. My hands trembled as I loaded it, nearly dropping the bright red cartridge before managing to snap the barrel closed. I rushed back to the window, aimed at the sky, and fired. The flare shot upward with a hiss, sending up red smoke as it flew high above the tower. It burned brightly against the blue sky, impossible to miss. I watched the helicopter through my binoculars, waiting for it to change course, to turn toward the distress signal. It didn't. The pilot either hadn't seen the flare or had chosen to ignore it. The helicopter maintained its search pattern, circling the area where the ground teams worked. I fired a second flare, then a third, emptying the flare gun in desperate succession. 3 bright red signals burned above the tower, calling for help that never came. The helicopter completed its circuit and began moving west, away from both the search area and my tower. I watched helplessly as it grew smaller in the distance, taking with it my last hope of rescue. When it disappeared from view, the silence that followed seemed deeper than before, more final. I slumped against the wall, the empty flare gun falling from my numb fingers. The brief surge of hope made its absence more painful, making me feel completely empty. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at nothing. Minutes or hours passed before I forced myself to move, to check the forest edge again. The figures had returned, resuming their positions around the clearing as if they'd never left. 7 tall silhouettes standing perfectly still, watching and waiting. The day dragged on, each minute stretching into what felt like hours. I went through the motions of my duties, looking for smoke, recording weather data, but my heart wasn't in it. What was the point of watching for forest fires when something far worse already surrounded me? As dusk approached, I prepared for another night of vigilance. I checked my rifle again, counting the remaining ammunition. 28 rounds left. Enough to hold off an attack, perhaps, but not enough to fight my way through 7 of those things if I tried to escape. Night fell, bringing with it the familiar dread that had become my constant companion. The figures remained at the forest edge, visible only as darker shapes against the darkness of the trees. I kept watch from the windows, moving from one to another in a circuit that had become routine over the past days. The howling began just after midnight. It started as it always did. A single voice calling from the north. A sound that began as a wolf's howl before twisting into something else. But tonight, the others joined in immediately, creating a chorus that surrounded the tower from all directions. The sound was louder than it had ever been, more insistent. Within the howling, I could clearly make out words now. My name, repeated over and over, and other phrases that scared me to my core. Join us, Matthew. Become Matthew. Hunger, Matthew. The voices rose and fell in waves, sometimes speaking in unison, sometimes calling individually. The words weren't spoken so much as suggested, pushed into my mind through that terrible howling. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, hitting directly in my skull. I couldn't block it out, couldn't escape it. I noticed something change, different from the pattern I'd gotten used to. The figures were no longer standing at the forest edge. They had moved into the clearing, coming toward the tower in a tightening circle. I grabbed my rifle and rushed from window to window, tracking their progress. They moved with that same jerky, too-fast motion I'd seen before, covering ground in bursts that seemed to skip frames, like reality itself couldn't properly process how they moved. They reached the base of the tower and stopped, making a perfect circle around it. 7 tall, thin figures looking up with faces I couldn't see but could feel watching me. For several minutes, they stayed completely still, the howling continuing non-stop. Then, as one, they began to climb. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they came up, moving in perfect sync. Their movements were wrong, too quick, too angular, limbs bending in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. They climbed with inhuman speed, covering multiple steps with each jerky motion. I backed away from the windows, rifle raised, unsure where to aim as they approached from all sides at once. My back hit the bathroom door, and I got an idea. A last desperate attempt at survival, or at least at controlling how this ended. I pushed open the door and quickly gathered what I needed: my journal, the radio, a flashlight. I retreated into the small space, locking the door behind me. The bathroom had no windows, no other entrance, just 4 solid walls, a sink, and a toilet. It was the closest thing to a defensible position I had left. Outside, the howling stopped. The sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. I could hear them moving around the main room of the tower. Footsteps on the wooden floor, the scrape of furniture being moved, the creak of floorboards under weight. I sat on the floor with my back against the far wall, rifle across my knees, and opened my journal to a blank page. If these were to be my final moments, I wanted to leave a record, an explanation for whoever might find this place after I was gone. My hand shook as I wrote, the words uneven but legible. Final log entry, September 12th. My name is Matthew Anderson, fire lookout at Copper Mountain. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. What I've experienced here isn't madness or hallucination, it's real. The Wendigo is real. It took David Wilson last year, and now it's come for me. They're outside the door now, 7 of them. They were human once, I think. Now they're something else. They hunger. They want me to join them, to become like them. I won't. I can't. I've tried to call for help. No one answers. I saw a helicopter today, but they were looking in the wrong place. They don't understand what's happening here. To whoever finds this, burn this tower. Burn the forest if you have to. Don't let anyone else come here alone. The Wendigo is patient. It will wait for its next victim. Don't let there be one. I'm sorry, Robert. I should have told you everything from the beginning. Maybe you knew already. Maybe that's why you stopped answering. I won't become like David. I won't become one of them. This is Matthew Anderson, Copper Mountain Fire Lookout, signing off for the last time. I set down the pen and picked up the radio for one final attempt. Base, this is Copper Mountain. Emergency. Do you copy? Over. Static answered me, as I'd known it would. I wasn't expecting a response anymore. The transmission was just a formality, a last gesture toward the protocols I'd followed faithfully until everything had gone wrong. A scratching sound came from the door, long, slow drags across the wood. Not knocking, not an attempt to break through, but a message. They knew I was inside. They were letting me know they could get to me whenever they chose. Matthew. The voice was barely a whisper, but I heard it clearly through the door. It was David's voice, or what remained of it, cracked and dry, with something else underneath, something ancient and hungry. "Let us in, Matthew. It's easier if you don't fight." Another voice joined in, this one higher, almost childlike but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. "The hunger isn't so bad once you accept it. It becomes everything. It becomes you." A third voice, deeper than the others. "We've been waiting for you since last summer, since David told us about you. The next lookout, the next feast." Their voices mixed together, making my skin crawl. They spoke of hunger, of transformation, of a cold that burns from the inside out. They promised relief if I joined them willingly, pain beyond imagining if I resisted. The scratching at the door grew more insistent. The wood began to splinter, thin cracks appearing along the frame. They were trying to get through, looking for weak spots. It wouldn't hold for long. I checked my rifle one last time, making sure a round was chambered. 28 bullets wouldn't save me, even if I could somehow kill all 7 of them, and I wasn't convinced bullets would stop them. There would be more. There would always be more waiting in the forest, ready and starving. A thump against the door made me jump. They were no longer being subtle. They wanted in, and they were done waiting. The door shuddered under another impact, the frame cracking visibly now. One more hit would likely break it open. I made my decision then. I wouldn't end up like David. I wouldn't become what David had become, a thing of hunger and cold, hunting in these woods forever. I wouldn't join their howls in the night, calling to the next lonely soul who took this post. I placed the barrel of the rifle under my chin. My hand was steady now, the trembling gone. In this final moment, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. The decision was made. The end was mine to choose. A crash from outside told me the door had given way. Through the splintered wood, a face appeared. David's face, but wrong, stretched too tight over sharp bones, smiling with too many teeth. His eyes found mine, and his smile widened impossibly. Hunger and want clear in his look. "Too late, Matthew," he whispered. "We're already inside you." I closed my eyes and squeezed the trigger.